Okay.
All right, everything looks good from my end.
Okay.
We have just a few minutes before 12, so we'll wait till then to get started. Give people a few more minutes to get logged on.
I saw you had somebody else do ACEs a few weeks ago. So hopefully it's not going to be too much repeat.
Yeah, I think it'll be really good. Well, I have 12 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started because I know everybody's time is valuable. I want to welcome everybody to the Great Plains for Illegal Drugs and Opioids in Indian Country webinar series, sponsored by the Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Program. I want to give a huge shout out to SAMHSA, who provided the funding for this project and this grant. Our Great Plains Native Connections program over in Fort Thompson, South Dakota, who is helping to facilitate with our HHA Facebook page over there. Our HPOG program, which is our educational program at Great Plains. And our Great Plains Epicenter. Thank you, Brooke, for helping us get everything set up and being there and getting everything going for us. A few housekeeping items. If you have questions, you can save them till the end when we'll open it up for Q&A with Tania today. Maddie and Brooke will be facilitating our Facebook questions. So if you're watching from Facebook and you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in and they will facilitate those to our presenter today. Welcome to week 17 in our webinar series, Endangered Children and Adverse Childhood Experiences 1. I know we had adverse ACEs a few weeks ago, but we have a different presenter and a different take on this. I want to introduce to you Tania Barnhart. She's from the Colville and Umatilla tribes. She has a background in law enforcement and became an addictions counselor 23 years ago in both in and outpatient Native programs and was a treatment specialist in a juvenile detention center. She's been a Head Start teacher and suicide prevention specialist, and along the way spent several years volunteering in domestic violence prevention. She became introduced to ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences, in 2008 at a training she attended as a Head Start teacher and wanted to become involved in learning more and spreading the awareness ever since. She moved to North Dakota 7 years ago and served Trenton's Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Victims Services Program from 2017 until 2020. In 2019, she became a master presenter of both ACEs and the follow-up to it, Building Resilient Communities. She's passionate about preventing violence, especially through early intervention and protecting the abilities of children and all people to live in safety. I want to thank you, Tania, for being with us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to share this information. Like you mentioned, it's something I've really been passionate about for a long time. And so hopefully this presentation today is not too much repeating and does give a different perspective from what you heard earlier. So adverse childhood experiences was research that began a few decades ago. And really in every major public health discovery, the first actions that save lives are 1, to accurately share the facts, and 2, to take informed action within our own spheres of influence around us. So I'm here today just to give you a preview of some key elements of a longer presentation. This is actually a 16-hour presentation condensed down to 2 hours. So if it feels like there's some gaps or missing information, feel free to ask, because you're right, there is. But hopefully you'll get a good enough overview of it today within these 2 hours to get a good understanding anyway. So I'm more than happy to continue sharing this information in longer presentations if you're interested. But today I'll give a brief overview of the main topics. So the presentation includes some in-depth information about the neurobiological effects of adversity on development, the impacts of childhood adversity and trauma on population health overall, and resilience, what we can all do to improve the health and well-being across the lifespan. Let's see. So CRI is the organization behind ACEs, and they're the Community Resilience Initiative. So they were the first community-wide initiative to bring the emphasis on resilience through exposure to an understanding of the ACEs study and the neuroscience on toxic stress and brain architecture. So if you've seen the video Paper Tigers, they're the engine behind that. And that's kind of the framework on which ACEs is the framework on which this presentation is, the film is based. So they had 12 years of working and building community capacity through scaffolding resilience, and that's all part of that story. It's really an excellent video if you haven't watched it. I'm not sure if it's available on Netflix, but you can search it up, and it's really a powerful video. So there's a lot of acronyms. You probably won't even hear most of them today, just a few. But I love the acronyms. They help remember things, make things easier to remember for me anyway. So ACEs is found, really has a KISS framework. And KISS is knowledge, insight, strategies, and structures. Each one connects to the other and helps us move forward in trying to build some community capacity for resilience. So the framework is based on over 9 years of work in Walla Walla, and they worked in a school there with children who were really at their last end of the education road. So it's kind of like an alternative school for challenged children, and they really thrived in that environment with this work that they did. So it provides our learning from these initial years of work in the sectors in the community that was involved in CRI. So sharing the framework can really help others learn from those experiences and perhaps launch your own work or strengthen your own existing coalition based on their learning and their reflection, and focus on building resilience to create a really thriving community. So ultimately, this work is a social movement and a public health framework. So when we know how to build human capital collectively, we create stronger communities that can thrive and the impact of risk better. So we've learned that the KISS is a framework people understand, and it's aligned with the scaffolding concept. So I also have a whole list of resources on the research that went into this and the people that contributed to the ACEs study, and I can provide that if people are interested. Oops. So memory is stored, memory of our experiences is all stored in our body. So there's a scientific debate, of course, over nature versus nurture, and that really is over, because now we know that the memory of childhood experiences does get stored in our bodies, not just our minds. We have physical memories of things that our minds don't remember. So from that very first bank of life, as cells divide and form a tiny human being, experiences has a profound impact on who we are and who we'll become. So in the past couple of decades, there's been an explosion of new understanding, beginning with the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study, about how and why adversity and trauma can reliably predict the risks for mental, physical, behavioral health, and productivity in the population. So this is really great news, because what's predictable is preventable. If we can predict it, then we can work towards preventing it. So because of recent discoveries in neuroscience, epigenetics, epidemiology, and resiliency studies, we can understand how protection, prevention, and resilience promotion can profoundly improve our health, safety, and productivity, and reduce public and private costs now and for generations to come. So it's really important to realize ACEs is not a diagnostic tool. So I didn't provide the ACEs quiz. It's only a 10-question quiz questionnaire, but I didn't provide it. And I can if people request it, but we really don't like to just hand it out. I don't know, I would say loosely, because a lot of times people can take that 10-question quiz and think it's kind of a fun quiz, but it can be triggering, and it can also lead people to feel really discouraged and think, wow, I have all 10 of those, I'm just doomed. You know, it can be really disheartening. It can also be, you know, deceiving if people think, well, geez, I don't have any of those, I don't have to worry. So it's not something that we want misused. It's not a diagnostic tool. Some schools have used it, places have used it to kind of assess where their kids are. And really, that's not a good use of it. We don't want to use it to try and diagnose people. It's not a screening tool. It's not a predictor on the individual level. We've probably all heard of celebrities, people that we know that have had just horrible conditions they grew up in and thrived and did extremely well. So we don't want to see the ACEs questionnaire used and have people predict that they have a doom and gloom future, that they're hopeless, or they're not college material because they have this high ACE score. So it's really important that it's understood that that's not what it is. So what the ACEs score actually is, it's a history tool. It's a communication tool to really comfortably talk about our life experiences and to become part of a common language. It's a gateway really to open up our empathy and compassion and healing so that we can help our communities become stronger. So it's really about changing the future of public health. Understanding ACEs is about discovery. It's a story of scientists. They challenge themselves to think differently and about the facts that they could see. So it's a story about their impatience with the amount of heart disease, diabetes, depression, suffering, and all those things that exist in our country. It's a story about the courage to set aside the common beliefs that can actually hide the truth, and about systematically testing new possibilities. And finally, it's a story about you and me and what we might do with scientific discovery powerful enough to really profoundly change the future of public health. So before we get into the ACEs study itself, we need to look just a little bit about brain development. So the human central nervous system connects us to ourselves and to other people in the world around us. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and it integrates all of our senses and information from receptors located throughout the human body. So it regulates the internal body functions, manages elaborate chemical and electrical signaling. The nervous system consists of sensory input in the context of each and every second, almost instantaneously. If you touch something and it's hot, you know that information goes to your brain instantaneously. It determines our understanding of and response to the world around us. So cells in the nervous system are called neurons, and they're stunningly effective at processing and transmitting that information. And they have a central purpose in doing so, to adapt the ways that keep us alive. So that information passes instantaneously as a survival tool. So for example, when people grow up with sustained danger, the stress hormones and neurotransmitters that are released as part of that child's fight, flight, or freeze reaction, they have impacts on the brain's functioning and mass. The brain prepares them for living in a dangerous world. Characteristics like being quick to anger, slow to soothe, hypervigilant, hyperreactive, those things actually help that species survive in dangerous times. But these same characteristics can also lead to cardiovascular disease, mental health challenges, and productivity problems. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the show Walking Dead or Fear the Walking Dead, but I've rewatched a few episodes lately, and it's really fascinating that there are two young men in that show. One of them is a student, they're both in high school age, and one of them is a drug addict who's been living on the street, that's homeless. When the chaos erupts and they have to survive in this world of zombies, the one that's been living on the street, that's a drug addict, is the one that thrives because he's used to living a day-to-day existence where he faces death. He's used to being fearless. He's used to having, that is the environment that he thrives in. And so he does amazingly well in the zombie world apocalypse. But the other student who is used to a stable home and going to school, he doesn't do so well. So that's the way ACEs really works. It's how your body is developed to respond to what's around you. It influences how you're going to react as you grow older, and your brain is developing all along. So those characteristics are really, really important. So adaptation versus expectation. Oops. So Dr. Martin Tiger, a leading researcher at McLean Hospital and Harvard University, he reviewed and approved all the brain science facts in this presentation. He says it's when our biology collides with social expectations that we run into trouble. So if you put a person from a really safe and sheltered childhood into a chaotic and turbulent environment, say like riot control, that person might struggle unless they've learned some really specific skills. So likewise, also a child adapted to a dangerous, stressful world might not sustain patience. He might not share, cooperate, or use words as a first choice. So when that child comes to school and we ask them to sit still, if we want them to share and to cooperate, there can be a really painful disconnect that is really hard for everybody. So the child will have to be actively taught all those skills that are required to succeed in that context. Just like you'd have to train a person from the benevolent path how to succeed in a chaotic and dangerous world. So the skills that people learn will help them succeed in the right environment. It's when there's a collision between social expectations that we run into trouble. So the ACEs study, we've been talking about the effects of toxic stress on individuals. Now we'll switch gears and talk about the effects of toxic stress on the population as a whole. So the field of epidemiology is what we'll look at. So epidemiologists are scientists who study the origins of disease, disability, productivity, and health in a population. So they help us focus our efforts on issues and processes that'll make the most difference for the well-being of everybody. So we'll talk about a large epidemiological study about the enduring effect of adverse childhood experience. Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti are the co-principal investigators of the study that we call the ACEs study. So most prior studies in the health and social effects of child abuse focused on a single type of adversity, like for example, sexual abuse. The ACEs study broadened that picture and included multiple types of childhood stressors instead of just one. So in addition, the ACE study measured a wide array of also looking at health and social problems. So the ACE study is really unique because it provides a potential to understand how multiple forms of childhood stressors in early life can affect many important public health outcomes. So design of the ACE study began in the early 90s as a partnership between the Center of Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Kaiser Permanente Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego. So more than 17,000 adult members of a Kaiser health insurance plan completed a survey about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. So they completed the survey about health behaviors, disease risks and disease, mental health and substance abuse, other health and social problems, and their ages were between 19 and 94 years old. The study participants were generally well educated. Most had attended college. Only 6% did not have a high school diploma compared to 13% of US population. They were predominantly white, middle-class people who had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. Study participants are still being followed to this day to assess the relationship of ACEs to causes of death, including disease, healthcare utilization, and use of prescription medication. So when we look at these numbers and statistics that I'm going to share, it's really important to realize that the people who participated in this had a lot of positives going forward, going for them. So when we compare that, for example, to I don't know, our impoverished areas, our rural areas, our reservations, when we compare that, we can imagine that there's a big disconnect. And I'll look a little bit at specific information regarding our tribes later on towards the end. But yeah, even with the ACEs scores we're going to see, these are people who had some, you could say, privilege, I would say. So the slide shows the 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied. The first groups are indicators of household dysfunction. That includes growing up with substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, battered mothers, and criminal behavior. 3 forms of childhood abuse were studied. There is emotional, physical, and sexual, and 2 forms of neglect were also included, emotional and physical. So as you can see from the percentages on the slide, the ACEs are common even in the middle class, well-educated population. Those are pretty sad to see such high numbers for a well-educated population. The ACE study found that ACEs are highly interrelated. So where there's one ACE, chances are there's going to be more than one. There might be 2 or several actually. So it didn't make sense to just study one category of adversity at a time. It made more sense to study the accumulation of adverse childhood experience categories. So the scientists made a simple score. Each category of ACE adds to the total ACE score. So from experiencing 0 ACE categories to experiencing all 10. So the ACE scores are that range. It's a range of 0 to 10. So people who report higher ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. In fact, as the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems goes up. So we call this a dose-response relationship. So, you know, dose response, the more gas you put into your car, the more miles you can drive. It's the same thing here. The more ACEs you have, the higher you're going to have a percentage of health problems. So in this slide here, you can see people with 0 ACEs being at about 5% with health problems, whereas it increases consistently, and people with 5 or more ACEs are above the 50% with health problems. So that's pretty staggering evidence alone right there, but we'll look much more in depth. So this chart provides an example of the relationship between ACE scores and health problems of liver disease specifically. So along the bottom horizontal axis of this chart are the ACE scores from 0 on the left to 4 on, or more on the right. And the vertical axis is the percentage of the population with liver disease. So you can see the percentage of people with 0 who had liver disease was just over 5%. And you can see the percentage of people with liver disease goes up in a stepwise fashion from just over 5% to 11% as the score goes just from 0 to 4. Now remember, the score actually goes up to 10. 10 is possible. So this is just a huge increase already from 0 to 4. It goes to above 10%. So this makes sense though, because the risk factors for liver disease include things like shooting up drugs with needles and syringes contaminated with hepatitis viruses, having intercourse with a person affected with the virus, or consuming large quantities of alcohol. And all these risks for liver disease are also increasing the ACE scores as increasing as ACE scores increase. So ACEs are common and ACEs are highly interrelated. Where you find one, oftentimes you'll find more than one. So they really have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of common health and social problems that's captured by the ACE scores. So an ACE score is really a good proxy measure of the dose of toxic stress experienced during childhood. People with a higher ACE score are more likely to have multiple health and social problems. Some of those increase their odds of their children having high ACE scores as well. So then we have a cumulative effect. So the discoveries about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain provide biologic plausibility for the ACE study findings. Scientists have established a strong case for concluding the relationship between the ACE score and health problems is really a cause and effect relationship. And I left out the slides and the part about the brain development, but it really goes into in-depth discussion over the chemicals that are released when we're experiencing stress. And that starts before we're even born. So we can be in utero and exposed to stress, and the stress hormones and chemicals that the mother makes are passed on to the baby and the fetus. So a baby can be born already with the brain development impacted by the stress of their environment. And then of course, you know, as they're an infant and growing up as a child, being exposed to stress, those same chemicals are released in their own body that impacts their own brain development. So I left those slides out because when you kind of open that can of worms, you know, it goes really in depth, and there isn't time in the 2-hour presentation, but I'm more than happy to share that at another time. So you can see here the adverse childhood experiences, and it shows starting from conception, lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, and that leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and that leads to an adoption of health risk behaviors. It could be anything from being involved in an unhealthy relationship, smoking cigarettes, using alcohol, all kinds of things, academic performance. Those things will lead to disease, disability, and social problems. You can imagine academic problems or things like truancy, things like being hungry. Those are going to lead to maybe problems with income, employment, education. And of course, the end of this road is early death, unfortunately. So we'll look specifically at some more. ACEs don't just contribute to health problems, they also contribute to a lot of social problems. So here specifically, we look at a history of homelessness, excuse me. So people with 0 ACEs, we have a 2.2% rate of homeless. With 1 ACE, it's about the same. And then it starts dramatically increasing. People with 6 to 8 ACEs are up there at almost 30% rate of homelessness. And again, that's only 6 to 8. Some people we probably know on our reservations and other places will have all 10 ACEs. So it's pretty sad when it looks, when you can see that correlation to homelessness. Oops. So I'll do a few slides here. I won't go through each one of these because you can see them yourself, but I'll just highlight a few at least of the ones that stand out. Preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is really the greatest opportunity we have for improving the well-being of human populations. So in fact, the ACE study team and ACE interface believe this is one of the greatest opportunities of our time, perhaps of all time, as far as being able to help our population survive. So this slide shows the percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. The calculation that is commonly used to do this in public health studies is called population attributable risk. So this is displayed as a percentage, like an oil spill on the slide. The percentage of a problem coded by the oil spill represents the percentage of each problem that is potentially preventable by ACEs. So the percentages are really large. In fact, the high percentages on this chart are rarely seen in any other public health studies. So if they look at, for example, tobacco use and the things that cause it, you know, they don't oftentimes find something that gives a 36.7% causal rate for tobacco use. So the ACEs study really is eye-opening. It's really an incredible opportunity we have to make an influence on so many different areas. So the cumulative effect of ACEs really reflects a powerful opportunity for prevention. So no matter if you're working to prevent heart disease, if you're trying to prevent cancer or end homelessness or end hopelessness, or improving business profitability even, as we align a portion of our work around a common goal of preventing the accumulation of ACEs and moderating their effects, we're going to reduce all of these problems. So we might be just wanting to reduce one, but by reducing ACEs, we're going to influence all these different areas. So it's such a huge impactful opportunity. So, oops. So on this one, you can see 65% increased chance of developing alcoholism. Incredible numbers here for the impact ACEs have on our adult lives. 51% chance of being high risk for HIV, 45% increased risk for driving impaired in the past 30 days. That's not just a risk for that individual, but it's a risk for society, a risk for all of us. And this one we see a 78 increased chance of using IV drugs, 69% increased chance of having serious and persistent mental illness, 62% chance of being a victim of intimate partner violence. So if you think these are separate issues, they're not. Oftentimes they're really intertwined, and one increases the chances of another. If you have somebody who has a serious and persistent mental illness, there's a likelihood that they might also have an issue with substance abuse. You know, there could be self-medicating. Maybe they had a worker injury and that contributed to it, or maybe they've been unemployed and that contributed to it, or maybe they're unemployed because of these things. So usually where you have one, you're often going to have more than one. They're just so interconnected. In this one, we see a 54% chance of using painkillers to get high, 43% chance of work disruption to ill health, 15 to 30 days a month. So not just a little bit, 15 to 30 days, that's 50% of the month being having work interrupted because of ill health. So that can also lead to loss of income, maybe loss of vehicle, loss of children, custody, loss of home, all kinds of things. 33% chance of binge drinking. And again, that one can lead to all kinds of violence in the home, falls, injuries, missing work, being unsatisfied with your life or your work, all kinds of things. They're just all so interconnected. So in this one, there's a 62% chance of being homeless as an adult, 61% chance of being incarcerated. Being incarcerated increases the ACEs for their dependents, because now we have a dependent who's living with an absent parent, maybe living in a low-income home because there's only one income to support them. So maybe all kinds of things can come as a result. Trouble in school, maybe social troubles, all kinds of things that are going to lead to trouble with employment later. Just unbelievable connections that we see when one ACE is present. 59% chance of having 15 to 30 days of work disrupted because of emotional problems. In this one, we have a 67% report of life dissatisfaction, increasing chances for all kinds of high-risk behaviors. And what can that lead to? Tons of high-risk behaviors. 67% chance, increased chance of suicide attempts. 56% increase in anxiety diagnosis, increasing the chances again for substance abuse, depression, and high-risk choices. In my work as an addiction counselor, I would say easily most of my patients were on medication for anxiety and depression. So there's just no way we can separate these things. In this one, we see a 61% increase in drinking causing problems with your friends or family, interrupting your relationships in the past year. 48% chance of increased promiscuity that might lead to intimate partner violence, unplanned pregnancy, decreased income, education, STIs, diseases, all kinds of things. 41% increased chance of chronic depression. We'll look at parental depression a little more in depth later on. So if it sounds like I've just been throwing out ridiculously big numbers here, I really have. But remember, these numbers aren't just guesses or dark predictions. They're all science-based. They're all research statistics. They're all founded in studies that have been going on for decades. So it's not just a doom and gloom prediction here of what could happen. It's what has been happening already. So the issues are really complex. There's historical trauma, intergenerational adversity, sensitive development periods as children are growing up. There's ACE accumulation. If you have one and you end up piling on another and another. Progressive nature of adversity. And again, it's the progressive nature where one leads to more problems, which leads to more problems. Public and private costs and community variations. So each community might have a variation. You know, a lot of our communities are dealing with drug addictions. We're dealing with meth and all kinds of other drugs that are coming back and come and go. So there's different variations in different communities, but they all kind of are founded in similar basis. And on top of that, resources are finite. So we really need low-cost solutions that address the complexity of problems and foster big improvements in really varied environments. A lot of times people will say, throwing money at it, you know, some people say, you know, you just need to spend more on better programs, bigger programs, more staff. Other people will say, no, throwing money at it. You can't come into our community with lots of money and expect a result. We really need to find creative ways to address these things because they're not simple problems, and so they're not going to be simple solutions. So we have core protective systems. When people hear about the ACEs study, a lot of times they get discouraged and think, wow, this is already going on. This has already happened. You know, what do we do about it now? I mean, it can be really depressing and discouraging to hear those statistics, but that's not all. That's not where it ends. So what do we do about it now? Resilience. Resilience is really the way we battle it. So people get excited about the notion of resilience in part because it reminds us that our supportive actions really do matter. Our desire for resilience leads naturally to a search for ways to help families and communities. So there's really three protective factors, protective systems that interact and guide positive adaptation. So these powerful systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging, and community, culture, spirituality. So attachment and belonging is with caring and confident people. We don't want to just assume attachment and belonging is all that matters because people have attachment and belonging in street gangs too. So it needs to be with caring and confident people. And a protective community with faith and cultural processes. So what do we know about individuals that do really well despite adversity? There's lots of people that just thrive despite the horrible backgrounds they come from. We know that the three protective systems are nested. People do best when they're living in thriving families and communities. So we can help one another to develop personal attributes that help us all weather life's storms. Personal attributes like positive view of one's life, self-efficacy, self-regulation. Those are all discussed at length in the resilience literature. And in the next presentation I do next week, I'm really going to talk mostly about resilience, the next step from beyond ACEs and building resilient communities. So in the full length version of this presentation, we go into detail about each one of those systems, including what helps to build them up, examples of implementation of resilient science, and how you can contribute to self-healing communities. In this one, the 2 hours really isn't a lot of time, but we'll touch on those things. So cultural respect and continuity is vital. When communities engage in capacity building, they dig deep into the human experience. that have shaped their past and influenced the present. So from generation to generation, people pass their history and experience, including rich heritage, language, and tradition, and also its experience of historical trauma, slavery, racism, and injustice. So while the ACE study didn't measure historical trauma like slavery and children being taken away from their parents or forced to deny their culture and language in boarding schools, neurobiology research would suggest that these and other traumatic experiences that elevate stress hormones for long periods of time during child development would definitely have enduring effects. I mean, if you can imagine how the stress hormones impact somebody from the ACEs that we talked about earlier, imagine the intense impact that you would have from being forcibly removed from your family and put in boarding school, from the traumatic experiences that the children have faced and that the parents face, losing their children that way. So it was all around trauma that was forced upon our ancestors. And it wasn't just temporary, it was long-term, ongoing, and that's going to impact the brain development of every person involved. So for every trauma history, there's also a survival history, a history of resilience. Cultural continuity, including reclaiming your cultural ways after a time of loss, it's a powerful driver of well-being. So Doctors Bonnie and Eduardo Duran advised one of the first things that has to be done is to ask the community, what is important to the community? It's a very simple question, but it needs to be asked and it needs to be answered. So communities are the ones that know the answers to their own problems. Visits to communities which have developed their own programs demonstrate both their creativity as alive and well at the community level. The strength of commitment shown when the program is owned by the community is much greater than when it's not owned by the community. So rather than outsiders coming in, when the community is behind it, that's where the strength is. So having tribally controlled police and fire significantly having tribally controlled police and fire, self-government, land claims, education, health services, cultural facilities, all those things significantly reduce the relative risk of suicide among youth. So the right to self-govern reduced relative risk of youth suicide by 85%. That's a huge percentage. So that really can't be overlooked or ignored. I mean, that must be given the credence due. While cultural continuity and education reduced relative risk by 52%. Can you imagine reducing risk 52% of suicide? So adverse childhood exposures and alcohol dependence. There was research done actually among 7 tribes to look at the impact on Native people. Between 1998 and 2001, researchers at the University of Arizona with support from the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism conducted 1,660 face-to-face interviews across 7 different tribes in America. They expanded on the CDC and Kaiser Permanente study by adding exposure to boarding school, foster care, and adoption to a survey of adverse childhood experiences. Interviews were conducted in 7 different tribes: Minnesota, Oklahoma, Oregon, Tennessee, and 3 in Arizona. So the research team included 7 different researchers, including one of the 13 Indigenous grandmothers, Mona Palaka. So early death, again, we see similar to the other ACEs study. This one focused on Native people. You can see the foundation of historical trauma leads to adverse childhood experiences, which impacts the brain development, leads to alcohol dependence, and of course other things, but they were specifically studying alcohol dependence. So that's why that's addressed on this slide. But of course you can imagine all the other ACEs this is leading to. And again, alcohol dependence leads to alcohol-related disease, disability, and social problems, and early death, unfortunately. So the researchers really wanted to learn whether historical trauma was an underlying issue or cause of that progression of adversity in the pyramid, and their hypothesis was that the historical trauma increased the risk for adverse childhood experience. So then they looked at the abuse and neglect. Among these 7 tribes, 9 categories of childhood adversity were considered. Oops. 9 different categories: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, boarding school placement, foster care placement, adoption, and having alcoholic parents. The study found that in these 7 tribes, adverse childhood experiences are common and highly interrelated. Only 14% of participants experienced no adverse childhood experience. 14% didn't experience any. So what does that mean? That means 86% of the participants experienced some adverse childhood experience. 33% experienced 4 or more categories. So 1/3 of our tribal populations have 4 or more ACEs. And we've already seen the impact in what we would say is sort of privileged communities when they have up to 4. It's astronomically higher than people that have 1 or 2. So then the odds of alcohol dependence in 7 tribes. So this chart shows the odds of becoming dependent on alcohol for different groups. The horizontal axis reading left to right along the bottom of the chart is the number of adverse childhood exposures from 1 to 2, then 3 and 4 or more. It only goes up to 4. So remember, there's actually a possibility of 10. The height of the bars is the number of times a group of people is to become alcohol dependent as compared to somebody with no adverse childhood exposures. So again, we see a dose response here. The higher the number of adverse childhood exposures, the higher the risk for becoming alcohol dependent. The group with 1 category was 2 times more likely than the group with 0. The group with 4 or more was 7 times more likely. And again, that's only going up to 4. A lot of people we know have 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. In addition to the finding that accumulation of different categories of exposure matters, the researchers also found the group of people that experienced sexual abuse had increased risk as compared to people with an equal number of adverse childhood exposures that have not been sexually abused. So combined physical and sexual abuse really significantly increased the odds of alcohol dependence for men, whereas sexual abuse and boarding school attendance significantly increased the risk for women. So in this one, we look at thoughts of historical loss among Indigenous youth. So one challenge that we have when we talk about historical trauma is the word historical, because when we hear that word, people tend to think that something in the past, but historical trauma is in the present. It's not just in the past. It's in the ways people relate to one another. It's in our bodies. It's in our daily thoughts of people affected by historical trauma. So this slide is from a study that asked children about their daily thoughts about loss. So daily thoughts about loss, children 11 to 13 are giving these answers. Losses from effective alcoholism, 24% of these children think about this daily or several times a day. Loss of our people through early death, 23.4%. Loss of our language, 23%. And you don't think, that kind of might surprise you that the kids 11 to 13 are thinking about loss of language, but they're the ones who answered and they're the ones who are telling us they do think about it. And it does affect them. Loss of culture, 20%, 20.6. Loss of land, 20.5. Loss of spiritual and traditional ways, 19%. Loss of trust in white people and broken treaties, 14.8. Loss of family ties, boarding school, 12.4. Loss of families and relocation, 11.8. Loss of self-respect and poor treatment from the government, 11.7. That might be the smallest number there, but when you think about it, think of 11.7% of our youth having a loss of self-respect. And think about that effect on our academic success, getting by in school, having good relationships. When you have a loss of self-respect, how do you have a healthy partner relationship? And then especially suicide, loss of self-respect. Just imagine, this is over 10% of our 11 to 13-year-old youth. So this is really information that we just need, we can't turn a blind eye to. We can't walk away from these figures and the opportunity that we have to improve these numbers and statistics for our children. So if you turn to one or two people sitting next to you, and in Zoom, we don't have that opportunity, but in a larger setting, you know, we might have a room full of people. Think, what are the ways that we are lifting this burden from the children that we know, or the children that live in our community? We don't want our children to have to be thinking about these things several times a day. So how do we take that burden from them? How do we improve their outlook on life and help them not dwell on these things that are going to bring them down? What steps do we want to take? How can we help them be resilient? So it's really important to know that our ACEs are not our destiny, absolutely not our destiny. It's information that's powerful. It's a powerful tool to put in our arsenal of tools that we can use to build a stronger community. They're not a destiny that's guaranteed. It's not an outcome that if you have a high ACE score, you're going to fail. Absolutely not. So people affected by ACEs are becoming leaders of self-healing communities every day. So the next section, Help That Helps, is talking about resilience. So resilience is found in communities and individuals where help is given. And I say given and not available because we all know there's lots of help available for things like domestic violence, poverty, suicide, addiction, diabetes, education. It's available, we know that, but it's not always given. It's not always asked for, it's not always received, it's not always welcome. So being available is wonderful, but being received is what we need to have happen. Having help available is a huge asset, but having that help be utilized makes impact. And help doesn't need to be limited to professional services, doesn't need to be limited to agencies. Individuals with zero professional background can make the most tremendous difference in the world. It doesn't require a fancy education, a degree, a fancy program, or a grant. Those things are not necessary. So for example, I can tell you when I was a young mom, I had a 2-year-old that was very, very challenging. And he was at the time from 6 months old until 18 months old. He was sexually abused at a time when he didn't have words. He didn't have the size to protect himself. So he was an angry and violent child. By the time he was 2, he had split my lip open multiple times. He was a child that was kicked out of daycare, every daycare in town. By the time he was 3, I was a young single mom trying to work, trying to go to school, and needed daycare. I had to take a taxi 10 miles out of town to go to a grocery store, and he was in the store screaming and crying and throwing a huge fit, trying to knock things off the shelves, trying to fight me, trying to just be a monster. And I'll tell you, I was terrified of the looks and the thoughts people were giving. And a woman came up and she walked past me and touched my shoulder and she said, "You're doing a great job, don't give up." And she kept walking. She didn't stop or say anything else. I never saw her again. But I'll tell you what, for the rest of my parenting years, this was 25 years ago, and to this day, it makes me emotional thinking about those words and how much I relied on those words as I went through the next 20 years of challenging parenting. I mean, if you think about the possibilities that we have to help each other in tiny little ways that can be so impactful, no fancy degree, no program, just being a community that supports each other, offers help when we can, whatever help we can. It doesn't have to be monetary, financial, it doesn't have to be items, just a few simple words, just being there for somebody. Those things can help somebody in ways that we just can't even imagine. So help that helps. There's 4 resilient factors that make a difference, and they're even more powerful when we layer them up. So feeling social and emotional support and hope, having 2 or more people who help, 2 or more people that actually give concrete help when it's needed, community reciprocity. So that's watching out for children when they're in trouble, doing favors for one another, and social bridging, people that reach outside their social area for help with family and friends, for their family and friends. So those are just the critical 4 areas that we need to develop in our communities. So support, feeling socially and emotionally supported and hopeful. always, usually versus rarely or never. So there's a lot of research about how feeling socially and emotionally supported impacts outcomes. We're going to look at some of the statistics, just like we had the ACEs numbers about how the adverse childhood experiences affected us. We're going to look at how some of these positive things affect us and what outcomes we can influence. So we'll look at each one and give a comparison. So on this first one, ACEs and activity limitations. So these are people that have low support and hope, and look how high their activity limitations are due to their health problems. With 0 ACEs, they're at 25, above 25% of the population. At 4 to 8 ACEs, they're up there at 50, it's double. So these are people with little hope and little support. 50% of the population has activity limitations because of health problems. On this next one, look at the impact when they have high support and hope. Their activity limitations are drastically reduced. So it's unbelievable the amount of impact having support and hope makes. So the population affected from at 0 is slightly above 10. It's up to about 30 with 4 to 8. Much decreased impact. About smoking, smokers that have low support and hope, it increases with the ACEs, just like the rest of the research on other ACEs. Goes from about 20 up to about over 35 with 4 to 8 ACEs. Look when they have support and hope, drastically reduced. It's about almost half. So when they have high support and hope, a huge reduction in the percentage of population that's negatively impacted. Look at sleep. Not enough sleep for 7 or more days in the past month. And I don't go into it here, but having not enough sleep has tons of negative health outcomes. It impacts us in so many ways. So when we don't have support and hope, people with high ACEs have a lot of trouble with sleep. Now look when we have support and hope. Again, it's dramatically decreased. Having support and hope dramatically helps. ACEs and poor mental health. Again, it increases, starting from 0 up to 4 to 8. And again, remember the score goes to 10, but even up to 4 to 8, it's nearly 40% with low support and hope. With high support and hope, look at that. One of the most dramatic differences of all. And mental health affects so many different areas of our life. Imagine how many ACEs would be impacted with having our mental health addressed. Just that one alone will affect just a tremendous number of ACEs. ACEs and poor health, poor physical health, more than half the month with low support and hope. Here it is with high support and hope. Again, dramatically decreased. It's just shocking how much we can impact the outcome of our, improve our communities by giving each other support and hope. That's not something we have to pay for, not something we have to buy, something we can all do. ACEs and the ability to work. At 4 to 8 ACEs, it's 20%. At 0 ACEs, it's at 10%. Look at that. With hope and support, it drops so far down. It's about 2.5% with 0. It's about, what, 7% with 4 to 8. Incredible difference. Think of the residual effect on income, education, safety, hunger, sleep, intimate partner violence. All kinds of things are impacted with the ability to work. So help means having 2 or more people that will give concrete help when needed. So a lot of times there's lip service given, people will say, hey, let me know if you need anything. A lot of times people don't reach out, or they don't tell you what they need. So it's having people that are willing to step up and give that help when it's needed, that can recognize a need and step forward, bring some meals to somebody, stop by just to check how they're doing. Don't wait for them to reach out. ACEs and hunger. Hunger and having not enough money with help. So at 0, it's between 10 and 15. At 4 to 8, it's almost 35. Excuse me. And then look at that with help. Dramatic. Below 5 with 0. barely above 10 with 4 to 8. Incredible difference. ACEs and diabetes. With no help, diabetes is a problem that's really prevalent in our tribal communities. So here it is with no help. Look at the difference when there's help. It drops by more than half at 0 ACEs. It drops from above 10 to below 5. At 4 to 8 ACEs, it goes from 15 down to just above 5, probably about 7. So again, just below half. Look at that difference. ACEs and depression. Depressed all or most of last month. Oops, without help. And there with help. Unbelievable difference. That's one of the most dramatic differences also. I mean, we go from about 9 down to 2 for 1 to 3 ACEs. And again, that's minimal. A lot of our people in our communities have a lot more than that. So just think about the huge difference we can make. ACEs and mental health or mental illness symptoms. Here we are without help, and here we are with help. Again, it's less than half in each of them. We can reduce over 50% just by offering help. ACEs and poor health, moderate to serious mental illness without help. Here it is with help. I think I made typos and put with help on some of those slides, but you can tell the difference. Moderate, serious mental illness with help here is cut again by more than half. A huge difference when we can offer help to our neighbors, our community members. So functional days. For poor health, we consider during the past 30 days for about how many days did poor physical or mental health keep you from doing your usual activities, things like your self-care, your work, your recreation, things that give us life satisfaction. So adults with 3 or more co-occurring days, co-occurring diseases, excuse me, and days unable to do their usual activities without people who help. And here it is with people that help. Again, it's reduced in every situation. Even the middle one, 1 to 3 ACEs, where there's a drop, it still reduces when people have help. It's still a lower number. Depression among caregivers or young children. So we mentioned depression earlier. We'll look at it a little more in depth here. So 12 to 17% of mothers of infants or toddlers report major depression. 12 to 17%. Up to 50% of those report persistent depression for a year or more. That's a lot of those people with persistent depression over a year. 25% of caregivers with report to child welfare services have major depression within the past 12 months. So, and that's a leading risk factor. The leading risk factor for that was intimate partner violence. 46.3% had ever suffered major depression overall. So when communities with high ACE prevalence also have high rates of reciprocity, parenting adults are less likely to be depressed. So we can impact all those areas. The depression, we can impact when we have communities with reciprocity, which is people helping each other. Reciprocity is people doing favors for each other. So doing favors for each other often or very often. And that's things like helping with shopping, lending garden or house tools, watching over property for each other. Just small, minor acts of kindness that go back to our community ways, our traditional ways, helping each other out, just being community. A lot of that has gone away with a lot of mistrust these days, a lot of crimes and things we hear about on the news make people less likely to want to trust others. But these are the things that are what we define as reciprocity, and this is what helps reduce the impact of ACEs. So you can count on adults in your community to watch out that children are safe and don't get into trouble. So this one sounds really simple. It sounds like it's just an automatic given, right? We all want the best for children. We don't want children to be unsafe. We don't want them getting in trouble. So it sounds like it's just too simple. But really, is that lip service? Traditionally, we all did look out for each other's children. So it's not something new. It's definitely not a news flash or something newly discovered. It's something that's been done historically for countless generations. And maybe as individuals we do, with children we know, we look out for them. But what about as communities? Do we hear gossip about abuse and neglect and just talk about it? Do we tell people what we heard and pass that gossip along? Do we have communities where violence is in the homes and it's well known, but it's swept aside or swept under the rug? We turn a blind eye to it because we don't want to get involved. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to jeopardize our own safety, or because they're related to somebody that's important in our community, we don't want to give their name a bad reputation or tarnish their image. We don't want to be known as a meddler. We don't want to be known as nosy or someone they can't trust. So there's all kinds of excuses and reasons we don't get involved. And a lot of us, we say that we want all the best, but then we sort of lay low when it comes time to getting involved or being active when we need to. Maybe we fear retaliation. So what options do we have besides calling the police or jeopardizing our own safety? Are we teaching creative ways to intervene in our communities with our families and children? So this is really a key concept of a project of First Nations Women's Alliance called Be a Good Relative. We need to think beyond the typical bystander viewpoint as if we're strangers, because we really are not. We're all related. All our neighbors and community members, they are our brothers, our sisters, our aunties, our grandmothers, and our children. We need to look at them as if they are, and not as strangers, not as just neighbors. No longer can we exist in disconnectedness if we want to heal our communities, if we want to change the environment that our children are exposed to. We want to change the ACEs scores of our generations growing up so that they can be reduced with each and every generation to make healthier communities. We can't exist in disconnectedness like we're strangers. We need to view each other as though we're all related. Our community members can be counted on to intervene if children are skipping school and hanging out in the community. So again, if we see children that are running amok and doing things that we have concerns about, are we speaking up? Are we intervening? Can we count on somebody? I had custody of my sister when she was in high school and she was on probation and required to attend school. I found out she had been skipping school for months and nobody told me. The school didn't contact me, nothing. Nobody told me. So this is an area that we need to all be stepping up in and make sure, if somebody sees my child not at school, I really hope that they'll tell me so that I can intervene and do something about it. It's just small little areas where we can all pitch in and help. So parental depression in communities with variable ACE prevalence and low reciprocity. So the rate increases typically significant with an increase in ACE scores, just like we saw before with everything. The ACE scores increase and the rate increases with low reciprocity. Where 47% of parenting age population have 3 or more ACEs, there's a 22% rate of depression. So that's where there's low reciprocity. So this is looking at the parental depression for parenting, people that are of the age to be parenting. Now we'll look at it with reciprocity. When we have reciprocity where the community is returning favors, reaching out to each other, being interconnected, looking out for each other's children, it drastically decreases. At 3 or more ACEs, it goes from 11.5 to 9.5, but look at the difference for the 22%, it goes down to 12%. That's for the people with 3 or more ACEs. So the change really is up to us. It's shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way that we relate with one another in relationships, families, and in communities. So there's a predictable pattern to transformative change. It begins with discovery and communication. It leads people to clarify their values and thinking. So with new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people can change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people will shape a new reality, really, that can become ratified in organizational and policy changes. The truth is, people create a new reality long before laws are passed. You know, we can't wait for laws, we can't wait for grants or funding, we can't wait for those things. It's really the people that can make the change possible. We have the most power. We have more power than anything else in our own connectedness, and we can have our own movements that are more powerful than any of that stuff. The change is up to us. It's shaped by our own thoughts. It's by our everyday conversations, the way we relate to one another in relationships, in our families, in our communities, the things that we're willing to tolerate, the things that we're not willing to tolerate. If we hear people joking about a domestic violence incident, we can speak up. We can say something. We can say, you know, that's really not funny. People laugh about those things a lot of times because they're used to hearing about them. They're used to seeing them. It's not something shocking. But we can change the way people think. We can change what's normal. We can make a stand, and regardless if we know those people, regardless if they are friends or family, anytime we hear about stories in the news, we hear about all kinds of things, incidents that happen around the world now, and people, just by humor, we can intervene and change the way people think and change the way our communities and our children are raised and what they think is normal. When we change what they think is normal, we change what people accept, what people tolerate, we change the trauma and we change the stress that is impacting their brain development. We reduce those things and give people a much greater advantage for thriving and succeeding. Excuse me. So as we work to prevent accumulation of ACEs, we need to keep in mind, we don't have to get to an ACE score of 0. Bringing our scores down to 0 will have huge effects, and we might not be able to prevent them from happening and occurring in a family. You know, there are families that have terminal illnesses that lose a parent because of illness. You know, they grow up in a single parent home. There's all kinds of things that happen. We can't ever just prevent all ACEs from happening. But certainly we can notice when children have 5 ACEs or something and make sure that number doesn't go to 10. We can, as we thread through all of our work, a new focus of supporting adults, particularly adults that through no fault of their own, they might have experienced many ACEs when they're children. We can prevent ACEs for the next generation. So we live in a time really of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time, perhaps of all time, is about family, community, and children. It's our reaction to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, that can profoundly improve our future. So please let me know if there's any additional information you would like as you have heard what I presented today. I know I skipped over a lot, might have left some gaps there, but definitely let me know if you have questions that I might be able to answer, or if you'd like more information on anything.
Tania, this is Stacy. I have a question.
Yeah.
And it's kind of seems like a no-brainer, but whenever you were talking about, you know, developing your ACE score and the removal of, and you went back historically to children being removed from their homes and whatnot, isn't it similar for children who, like, for instance, if DSS comes in and removes children out of a home, no matter, regardless of how unhealthy it may be for them,
Right.
doesn't that actually add to their ACE score?
Yeah, so for children being removed from their home, I mean, we can think of it in the historical sense of boarding schools, or we can think of it modern day sense. You know, they might be being removed for their own safety, their own well-being, to a safer environment, but they're still being removed from the people that they know and love. They're still being removed from relationships, even if they're unhealthy relationships. Those are the relationships that they rely on, and that's what they know. So even if it's for a positive reason, it's a good move, it still is traumatic. It still is going to put them through stress. It's going to put them through that biological and physical stress. Most definitely.
And I guess that's where the resilience would come in and helping them to overcome that.
Right.
Do we have any more questions? Does anybody have any comments or questions that they would like to ask? Brooke, can we go ahead and free it up so that people can unmute themselves and speak?
Let's see, I'm just looking in the chat here to see.
They'll have to raise their hands. I'll have to individually unmute them. But there are no questions from Facebook.
Okay. I guess I didn't look at, what was my time? I did go a little fast through it, so I ended early.
I did put the link for the survey over in the chat box.
Okay.
If they go ahead and indicate the session of Endangered Children and Adverse Childhood Experiences 1. If there's no other questions, we would really appreciate your feedback on the survey. If we don't have any further questions, I'm going to ask you to invite you, I should say, to join us again next week when Tania will do part 2. Can you give us a little recap of what we're going to do next week, Tania?
Yeah, so next week I'll be looking more at resilience and the resiliency, building resilient communities. Again, it's another 16-hour training that I'll condense down, and I'll try to do my timing a little better so I make full use of the 2 hours, because I kind of cheated you on the time this one. But it's, again, it's a 16-hour training that's just full of techniques and ways that we can overcome the ACEs and build resiliency in our communities. So it's some fun activities and information.
Well, that sounds really great, and we look forward to having you back and, looking at the, well, we do have a question over here. Do you think that Native communities handled COVID better than other communities?
I think that Native communities definitely took it more seriously and were more proactive. Yeah, and unfortunately we suffered more. So it's not like we didn't have a reason to. I wish we didn't have the reason to take it more seriously, but we sure did. I still hear a lot of people say, that it's not a big deal. And I think, gosh, if you knew the numbers on our tribal reservations and communities, you definitely wouldn't say that.
Well, each week, the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board hosts a COVID weekly update on Wednesdays at 10 o'clock Mountain Time. You can just go to our Facebook page. You can find the link for that, I'm sure, or our Facebook page either. But yeah, I think that maybe communities, Native communities took COVID maybe more seriously, and this is just Stacy's perspective. This isn't anything other than that. It was due to historical trauma and the things that, we've endured through disease.
Right.
Well, if we don't have any other comments or questions, Nick, who is one of our head epidemiologists, and I probably have his title all wrong. He says, tribal communities are taking COVID serious in the Great Plains area, but vaccination rates tend to remain low. And I'm very concerned about COVID variants causing resurgence among them. Very true, Nick. Thank you for your comment. Yeah. Well, like I said, I placed the survey link over in the chat box. If everybody could take a few minutes to complete that, we would greatly appreciate it. Like I said, invite you back next week on Wednesday at noon Mountain Time and 1 o'clock Central Time to let's look at resiliency. And we'll see you next week, Tania. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Everybody have a good week.
Mhm.